It's good to be back in the Kawarthas. It's funny you mentioned something that sort of sparked the memory. My first interaction with the Kawarthas actually goes back in 1978, when not as an employee of the Ministry of the Environment, but as a contractor to the Ministry of the Environment, I supervised the weed cutting in mostly the lower lakes, Buckhorn, Chemung. For those of us with some gray hair might recall in those days where the herring gulls were walking across the top of the middle of Chemung Lake on top of the Eurasian milfoil in the first major invasion of that weed, which you're still tangling with in Scugog, I see. Now, we cut over 900 acres of weeds that year. I supervised the cutting. I didn't do the cutting. I was representing the Ministry of the Environment, and we oversaw that. So that was the first part. Of course, it's good to be back here, though. We're closer to home because I taught for 3 years at Sir Sanford Fleming College in Lindsay. Started the environmental program there with Jim Adam back in 1986. Lived in Fenelon Falls, so it's a little bit like coming home to old turf. And Rob was kind enough to give me a list of 7 things to talk about, which should take us probably till 8 or 9 o'clock tonight. So I hope you're... So I decided maybe that wasn't the best thing to do. I thought I'd pick and choose from, and I only have my allocated time, in which case I've chose 3 topics to center on, but hopefully there's some questions. So I'm talking about some of the environmental issues relative to the Kawartha region. Certainly not all of them, because there's lots everywhere. So I've chosen 3, and maybe there's time for questions. We have the excess soil problem that's been referred to, and we have the phosphorus challenge, which I'll explain when I get to it, and something about climate change and the challenges to the conservation authorities, which Rob also alluded to, and maybe there'll be time for questions. You let me know. And if I don't press the right button, it doesn't advance. Well, maybe it doesn't advance anyway. What am I pointing at? That, right? Well, it worked that time. Okay. Excess soil. As Rob indicated back in just about a year ago, January 25th, I was up here keynote speaking and talking about, I don't call it a fill problem, and you'll see that's the point. I want to reprise a little bit of that talk because there's been some developments. Certainly in Ontario we have an awful lot of excess soil that we have to dispose of. How much? Well, this estimate is something up on the order of 25 million cubic meters. That's a lot of dirt. And much of it, as you can see the numbers in the yellow band there, comes from residential sewer and water main roads. It's a development-oriented material, and this material is moved, and much of it's moved to places like I can say Scugog Township, yes, Scugog, but now much beyond that. In fact, on the west side, it's going quite far north. This continues to be a challenge in the province of Ontario. So people look to this and say, well, it's a Ministry of Environment problem, but it isn't really a Ministry of Environment problem. As you'll see, that's the point I want to make. The Ministry of Environment problem only has jurisdiction over this material we move in trucks by the millions of cubic meters if it causes an adverse effect, which is a defined thing. It's essentially pollution. And a lot of this stuff does not cause an adverse effect, so it doesn't mean the Ministry of Environment doesn't have jurisdiction. They could also have jurisdiction if it's a waste, but it's not a waste. It's usually classified as something called inert fill, which is exempt from the environmental regulations. There's something called a record of site condition, which gives them some jurisdiction. But as long as there is a record of site condition, then the requirement under environmental law is satisfied. So the Ministry of Environment, although our concerns when raised when you see these truckfuls of soil coming up from Toronto and being dumped in our townships, our rural land, we're very concerned if the first response is to call Ministry of Environment, but know that they don't really have jurisdiction in many cases, and that's the challenge. Do the conservation authorities have jurisdiction is the other aspect. Well, there is if there's a possibility of pollution, but I'll tell you, and many years of experience in this, if it's not going to cause an adverse effect, it's not going to satisfy the test for pollution in the Conservation Authorities Act. So if it blocks the flow of water, there's very powerful rules, CA, but rarely is that the case. They try to avoid floodplains. So see, we're having a jurisdictional problem. What about towns, municipalities? Well, there are such things called site alteration bylaws, and they're fairly powerful. But the 2 things. One is they're trumped if the CA has regulations about pollution and about the material. It neutralizes the municipality's power. And as well, the municipalities are on the receiving end. I mean, the trucks are already, idling at the gate when the municipal authority starts, and that's not an adequate place to control something, right? So the municipalities, and I know the frustration, we've got a lot of municipal councils here, you know of what I speak. So the question I raised at a meeting last year, and I think it still is the question, is what about the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, and what about Ministry of Infrastructure? Well, more about them in a second, but certainly those are just question marks because they're not normally thought about. We go to the Ministry of Environment, we as the people, I mean, and I'm, you know, as good as the Ministry of Environment is with their meager resources, often they have no jurisdiction. So the way I conceptualize this problem is that we've got to stop thinking about this as a fill problem, because a fill problem is your problem. You've got to fill a hole, right? Fill. This is not a fill problem. It's a digging hole problem, okay? The reason we have a fill problem is because someone's digging a hole in Toronto or somewhere in the GTA, and that creates the problem. And why are they digging the holes? Well, they're digging the holes because, say, the City of Toronto has, you know, I use the example of the hole they dug across the street from my office on Bay Street. Well, they dug down 6 stories for parking for this condominium operation. Well, first of all, do we need to have 6 stories of parking under? That's just a municipal rule. It makes an awful big hole. And all that dirt has to go somewhere. Those are rules that can be changed. There's unnecessarily strict standards about the quality of the material and what has to be. So the easiest thing to do, and we don't reuse in Ontario any of the material, the soils, and don't incorporate it in the construction of the thing we're building or something related. As the last on the slide says, the problem is simply problem disappears around the corner with the trucks, right? What we do is we have this dirt, we dig it out of the ground, we put it in trucks and send it somewhere, and it'll end up in some place like Scugog Township, and it's no longer our problem. Well, this is a digging problem, and you know, rural Ontario collectively shouldn't be too eager to accept the problem caused by big city Ontario. So. Placement problems. The receiving municipality doesn't control the source. I've made that point. But often this material can compromise the land. And that's, now, subtle point here, very subtle point, but really important. And the reason this is moving, the reason that a lot of material, especially from what they call brownfield sites, is moving, it's because it's not contaminated enough to be waste. And neither is it contaminated enough to be cause an adverse effect in the law. But you wouldn't want your kindergarten students sitting and eating the dirt like they tend to do when they're, I guess, pre-kindergarten students. My little granddaughter's only 2 yet, so she's still doing it. And so there are categories of soil, and when you're converting land from industrial use to residential use, there are standards. They just simply say this: you shouldn't be building, you know, a residential unit on that land because it's like you can build another industry, no problem. It's clean enough for industry. It's just not clean enough for people to live there and do their day-to-day operations. It's a subtle difference. But what it means for the rural areas is this, and this is the classic example that came up at that conference where we had a gravel pit. Was it in Scugog? I can't remember. It doesn't matter. One of the townships up here. And it was a gravel pit that was taken, you know, they took the gravel out, and according to the rules and aggregates, they rehabilitated the landscape, so now it's recontoured and planted in grasses that could be one day hay, and it was, you know, it was put back to its productive use potentially with the gravel gone. And then the license was surrendered. But it was still zoned industrial because it had been a gravel pit. And because it was zoned industrial, you could bring up industrial dirt from the city and put it in a hole. And that's what was going on. That's going on in other parts in Ontario too. So this is all relating to the rules, and of course associated. So that means that land is forever industrial. Fine, it's clean enough to put an industry on. And if you're in the middle of, if you're downtown Toronto, who cares? You're going to put another industry, fine. But if you're in an agricultural township, it's not acceptable anymore. So these kinds of problems. This is like a forced zoning of the land. Not good. Things are a problem. Other things, you know, lots of nuisance problems with these trucks, certainly. Lots of compatibility problems. There's other issues related to this. But what's the fix? So the fix is, that I've been promoting, is to put the monkey back on the right back. This is not MOE's problem. It's not the township's problem, not in the sense of solving the problem. It's their problem and they have to deal with it. And it's not MOE's problem because they're largely powerless, although well-intentioned often. It is not really the Conservation Authority. They'll do what they can, but they can't do much. The problem is that the excavation earth materials must be managed on a life cycle basis. What it means is from cradle to grave is life cycle, or from point of origin till proper final management and disposal or utilization. And that should be the responsibility of the people that dig the holes, or the rules around digging the holes. So the whole responsibility, full cost of management of soil till it's satisfactory place for a final use. That's how you do it. And so big holes are largely as a result of policies of the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, and to some extent the Ministry of Infrastructure that gives a lot of money for all sorts of infrastructure development. And so we need some changes in the law. We need changes in the law that make them, those ministries and the people who are digging the hole, the construction companies that are actually doing it, responsible for the whole lifetime management of this material. And if you make them responsible, and one choice is to do it like the Europeans, I'll tell you, the British have come up with a solution. They started taxing every ton that went off a construction site. And guess what? All of a sudden the engineers over there found all sorts of real good ways they could reuse the soil on the site. Because they didn't start trucking it all, because, oh my God, I'm not paying that. Right? So make the people responsible for generating this problem responsible for managing the problem. If it ends up at the new elevated airport, okay, but that better be the choice of the township and the airport, a willing host. It better not be because that's a problem they're trying to fix, or some land has been taken out of it. By the way, airports are industrial use, there's no problem. So that's the one thing I talked about, is that excess soil problem, because I know that's something of interest up here. Before I go on to this slide, I want to talk to you about, I chose that, and I prepared these slides, and just today in the office, my Director of Operations called me and said, Gord, we got a letter from the Ministry of Environment. We had, under the Environmental Bill of Rights, any two citizens can file what's called a request for review. And two citizens did, I won't say who because it's not public yet, filed for request for review to the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing to say, reviewing the excess, what I call compromised soil, I use that term, that whole thing, the need for new policy. And the ministries can either turn that down with reason or agree to do it. And today, we got the letter. The Ministry of Environment has agreed to do a complete review of the policy around this problem. So that's good news. And they're going to do this. Part they mentioned in the letter, they're going to do public outreach and consultation. So there's an opportunity for the communities around here who are very concerned about this problem. There will be, coming in the next 12 to 18 months, in Ministry of Environment review. So by all means, this is your chance to get something changed. So that's sort of some good news, and we'll see how that goes. I want to talk about another subject. I want to talk about phosphorus. And Rob actually laid this out for me very nicely when he talked about, I really want your data from the sediment traps you put in the municipal drains. Because, phosphorus is a big problem. Phosphorus is a macronutrient of plant. It's released into the environment by many human sources, but it is highly disruptive to aquatic lakes ecosystems. Now, careful here, because I got some serious farmers in this crowd. I know that for sure. I'm going to talk about farms, but I'm not blaming farmers, okay? Just let me get it very clear. I know, especially you can get away with this in the Kawarthas, because we've got lots of cottage problems in the Kawarthas. We've got septic problems. We got municipal sewage plant problems. We got stormwater management problems, all of which you mentioned. You didn't mention farmers. Chicken. No, I did, okay.
Chicken farmers, too.
But I know it's a wide-scale problem, but I want to talk something about, there's been some developments on the whole phosphorus thing, and I'm going to focus on farm thing, not because I'm picking on them or not because I think they're the major cause in this area, just because they may be part of the major solution. And it's a new sort of approach that we're promoting here at my office. So on farms, it is challenging to maintain and to manage the levels of phosphorus in the soil. And quite honestly, you're on track when you prepare talks like this, and I got that letter from the Ministry of Environment. Well, yesterday I was speaking to the provincial executive of the Ontario Federation of Agriculture, and that can be a tough audience, and we have some very frank discussions. And one of them, after I finished talking and stuff, comes out, he says, and we were talking about phosphorus, and he says, on my farm, he's down in very far southwest Ontario, says, I got that clay soil, he says, he talked about the agronomist, I didn't know him from years ago, he says, and he explained how to manage phosphorus in soil, et cetera. He says, for 30 years, he's put no phosphorus on his farm because he knew how to manage it properly originally. he's getting 300 bushels per acre corn, and he's put no phosphorus on because he's managing his soil phosphorus properly. And I said, well, that's really the purpose of my talk today, this segment. So you said it better in one line, and I could have said it in my 5 minutes on this. But remember phosphorus, and here's the thing that's pretty nudity. The source of phosphorus, ultimately, the phosphorus we put, and this is the thing about farms, is the new phosphorus that goes into the cycle usually goes in through the farms, right? In other words, the stuff that comes out in sewage has already been through the farm, and it goes through us, and it comes out in sewage, and those things, right? So the point of source where we introduce new phosphorus into the system is usually in the food production segment. And phosphorus is, a geologic source. It's phosphate rock. It's finite. There's a lot of it, but there's a lot of recent discussion. This is the news, and it's subject to exhaustion. And in other words, there are various estimates about how much more phosphate rock we have available. And the estimates range from 60 years of phosphate rock to 300 years of phosphate rock. But the key thing is something may have heard of the term peak oil, but the thing is about peak phosphorus, by some estimates, is estimated to occur in 2030. Well, 2030 is not that far away. And what do I mean by peak forest? I simply mean that it will be difficult to maintain any increase in the amount of phosphorus mined, because it gets more and more remote, harder and harder to do it, and it'll get much more expensive. Because there are finite geologic deposits of stuff, and we, human beings around the world, we use a lot of it, and it's absolutely essential. So my point is that we discussed this in staff. We were concerned about what's the message about phosphorus? How do we provide good advice to government in this regard? And my staff and I came up with this. We said, it's really what you need is a way of thinking about, just like we changed profoundly the way we handled garbage by bringing in the 3 R's, which were originally the 4 R's. We dropped one off and didn't tell anybody. But we brought in the concept of, reduce, reuse, recycle, and it really stuck. And that was brought up in Ontario. It comes out of Ontario and went around the world. And it's a way of thinking about it. Reduced the waste. We're not always perfect. We know that. But at least it gets us thinking. Reduce. Why do we have so much waste? Reuse and recycle, right? Well, can we do something like that with in our thinking about phosphorus? And when I say that, I just don't mean, yes, it should start on the farm and the farm's thinking, but also it should start in government policy that supports the farmers in this regard. So maybe, do we reduce the need for phosphorus by increasing the soil organic matter? That's what SOM, the soil organic matter, and the living community in the soil. And that's a lead issue for my office and myself, is trying to get policies to encourage the healthy living soil with a higher organic matter content, so you need less because you're keeping it there. You retain it by by implementing best management practices, because a lot of the phosphorus leaves by erosion. So if particles of soil go, they take a lot of phosphorus with them, and something called phosphorus saturation. That simply means that you can build up so much stored phosphorus that when you and it may be geologically bound, and when you start adding it every year, that stuff is just lost. So that's just good best management practices. And then recycling, and here's one that farm residues, which farmers largely do, but always be diligent about farm residues, but also other materials from our society that can bring phosphorus that was out and bring it back. We now have, as of this year, a new system of classifying composts in the province of Ontario. Thank goodness, the Ministry of Environment got this right. And we have a category of absolutely clean compost. The rules set out, and a clean compost, which has no regulatory burden associated with, no rules, no permits, and it has to be tracked and traced, but then it's free to be put up back in the land. That's like for food waste and things like that. Waste streams that have phosphorus in them that are now lost, they could be brought back to land, and that's in a safe way. And that's one thing. And biosolids of a variety of some of which is done, but always we should be conscious of what material streams in our society, off-farm material streams that would be rich in nutrients, that we can properly, with no risk to our food supply, close the cycle and bring them back. So that's the recycle aspect. But these are hierarchical. Reduce the need, retain by best management practices, recycle when there are opportunity, bring but stereotypic, and at the last, replace what's lost from the system, because invariably there's loss from the system, replace it from mine material sources only as optimally needed. So that's one way of coping with the fact that phosphorus is a challenge going forward in the future, and if nothing else, the economics should drive this. So different way of thinking of phosphorus. Now I always got to put some science in there, some funny graphs that you don't, you roll your eyes, because, otherwise you realize that I'm not very smart. And, but I can wow you with the science. And, Rob covered, floodplain stuff, but he did it in a very user-friendly, and I'm going to lay on some science here. Okay, climate change as a challenge for Conservation Authority. There are many challenges with climate change. I could do a whole talk on, I could do more than one talk on climate change, but I chose one little segment here to talk about today. So I want to talk about, first thing about climate is that there's two words that you have to know. So people sometimes in the popular media have trouble with this. It is about global warming. It means that the Earth is absorbing more heat than traditionally it had. The Earth is getting warmer. The numbers were just released for 2013. 2013 was globally the fourth warmest year on record. But what that means, when the Earth is warmer, there's more heat generally in the atmosphere, there's more moisture because there's more evaporation of the water from the oceans, and the atmosphere holds more moisture. And the thing about moisture, yes, it's typically in the atmosphere, as we all know, and when the temperature drops rapidly, it's a classic thing, or there's upwelling, whatever the usual things of weather happens, the water condenses and falls out. If there's more moisture in there, when the usual weather things happen that cause rainfall events or precipitation events to happen, there's more to fall, right? And we get greater intensity of storms, and we've seen greater intensity of rainfall. As well, and this gets a little complicated, but there's one of the things that's happening, and you can see it being discussed to some extent in the media now, is remember if you look at weather maps, sometimes you see that big swoopy thing, the jet stream, that, for people my age, we used to say, because jet stream used to have little bends in it like this, and when you went to Vancouver, when you're coming out of Vancouver and you're flying back to Toronto, they say, hey, we're going to get to Toronto 30 minutes early because we caught the jet stream and everything's cool, right? And it flew right back to Toronto because it's a very high wind area that goes over the planet. Well, that is strongly affected when the Arctic warms up and the differential between the warm tropics and the Arctic diminishes. Now the Arctic is warmer than it was, and the energy that drives the jet stream relates to that difference between the cold north and the warm south. And that jet stream slows down. When it slows down, it doesn't go to this nice little soft bend. It goes, whoa, doo-doo, doo-doo-doo. And you can see that on the weather maps if you look right now. Massive. And when a jet stream does that, the weather systems that follow it don't move as fast. They tend to hang around. Got a massive drought in California right now, right? Or recently we had freezing cold in the east. Well, it's boiling up. You want warm? Go to Alaska because it's warm up there. And the weather systems that usually move through, remember, all my life, they move through in about 3 days. We're into a different kind of weather, and they start lasting longer. There's longer duration. So we have rainfall events that are more intense and of longer duration, because if it's going to rain, it rains for longer. By the way, if it's going to drought, it'll drought for longer too. But that's so this increase in intensity and duration of the rainfall is really important for conservation authorities, because these factors increase the frequency of flood events. And you set me up perfectly with your flood today, but think about it. Think about Peterborough a few years ago, massive, big flood. 2 years before that, massive flood. And so when we plan things, we look at, and this is what Rob was alluding to, we look at with this floodplain stuff, is that we look at the historical pattern of flooding and rainfall events, and we come up with something called intensity, duration, and frequency curves, IDF curves, in terms of planning. And that's where you hear these things like the 100-year storm or that sort of stuff. I got a kick out of the fact that the former the fire chief of Peterborough was Lee Grant. He and I grew up together in Timmins years ago, and I was out with him, and I was telling somebody, well, Peterborough had 200, had a 100-year storm and then a year off and then another 100-year storm. He says, no, Gord. He says, Peterborough had a 100-year storm. Maybe I got the order wrong, but I think it had a 100-year storm, a year off, and then a 300-year storm. So that's a frequency of an odd event. You look at all the rules, and you end up with something that looks like that. All that is across, up the top this is an American river. It doesn't really matter where it is. But a volume discharge, maximum river discharge in cubic meters per second up the edge there. And there's these lines, all these lines, and right through the middle, you won't be able to see it, so I highlighted it. The green line there is what it says the baseline. That's simply that. Okay. So if you go across there and you go across the bottom, it's a log scale, which is really confusing. But in the middle, it says 10, and out the end, it says 100, right? Those are the return years. So another, for a 100-year storm, you're looking out on the far end of the axis. You go up there until you see the green line, and for that particular watershed, the 100-year storm is just over about 210 or 215 cubic meters per second. So that's based on all those lines averaged, and that's years of people measuring it. People measuring, getting all that data, and they say, here's the curve for our particular water basin. And that's what the Conservation Authority has. But then they got them from, they got, I don't know, from the 1940s and the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s, and they get 40 years of data, and they got all these lines, and then they have a curve that says, we know what the recurring flood level, we know what to expect. We know every 100 years we'll have a storm of this magnitude. And what did you just say in your talk? You said, for the Burnt River, it was the highest level ever recorded. Well, what the heck's happening here? How come, right? I mean, what's going on? And of course, and with Peterborough, all these 100-year storms or multiple-year storms, very rare, it's because climate change is increasing the intensity and duration of rainfall, and we're having bigger and bigger storms. And these curves that we, worked so many years, and they worked for us through the 70s and 80s, in the 90s, and then they started causing problems after the turn of the century. Because, and this is not a real line, I'm going to put it by illustration. So we don't have that anymore. We have that. We have a line that's much steeper, so that what was so instead of at 100 years we get 210, we now get 210 at every 6 or 7 years on that my example, which is entirely arbitrary. But you see how that's what happens. That those really rare events become much more frequent because climate change has changed the rules. We have an infrastructure that's designed for a climate we no longer have. But here's the thing that I'm after about, and I haven't actually written about this, so I probably shouldn't be talking about it, but I have. It's in process. And that is, the question is, it's not that the curves have changed, and it's really, really tough for a conservation authority to plan for that. It's that we're in a period of time when the curves are changing more. They're changing year to year. And in other words, I make that fake red line up there to say it's even worse. And so more and more frequent storms. And we don't know, because we don't have a little cluster of lines, because the darn thing is changing every year. And so and that's a real technical problem for the people who work in hydrology, is how do we keep up with this change? Because that's what climate change is doing, because the IDF curves control the height of bridges, they control the size of culverts, and they control the location of the floodplain. And floodplains are really important. And we've done a very good job in the last 50 years in Ontario, not so much Alberta. And Calgary got a lesson about floodplains this year. And the reason that with our flooding is problematic, tolerable, is because for 50 years, since the conservation authorities were formed, more than 50 years, we've been planning our floodplains and trying to get ahead of this problem, and we have to a large extent. Not perfect, but Alberta does not do that, and they had paid a big price this year. And so that's the problem. Our infrastructure is built for this, the pattern of information, these IDF curves we have had for years, and they're no longer useful to us. They're not. We have to change it. And whose responsibility? Well, Rob mentioned he's doing some floodplain planning, and this is going over all the problems where you get municipal money, because there's got to be some development or something like that, right? But the kind of comprehensive plan that we did in the 1970s, where we looked at all the floodplains of all the populated parts of Ontario, and was done by the Ministry of Natural, money from the Ministry of Natural Resources in cooperation with the conservation authorities, and there's no more money. And the Ministry of Natural Resources has told me they're not doing it. And we're in an environment where the world is changing. It is more and more important than it's ever been since perhaps Hurricane Hazel in 1954. And it's not being done, except where conservation authorities individually can get a bit of money out of municipalities to deal with some particular problem. So that's a big challenge for the province, and it's one that you'll hear more from me on going forward, because the conservation authorities need the support to do the work. I don't care if the Natural Resources is going to do it, but they darn well better support the conservation authorities in getting it done, because it's really, really important. Otherwise, we'll get Alberta's problem. So, just to summarize what I've been talking about, so the challenges are many, and they're serious. The provincial government is retreating from its traditional roles. I talk in my reports about the Ministry of Environment constantly being cut back. Recently, the Ministry of Natural Resources is being devastated by this so-called transition they're going through. A lot of their key powers removed. Things where they used to do approvals and had field people with technical competence now going to permit by rule, which is sort of like, you go ahead and there's the rules, you do it. I'm sure you'll do a good job. And that might work in the short term, but it doesn't work in the long term because of the nature of people. So we have a retreat of the provincial governments of its roles, responsibilities, and fundings, and we continue to rely on the conservation authorities provide frontline environmental natural resource protection, as we have seen, with the impressive list of projects that were undertaken by this conservation authority. I'll tell you, the Ministry of Natural Resources would have a hard time coming up to this podium and listing as many pages of projects as you just listed. But, there's always a but. So CAs are the front line, but remember that unlike the Kawarthas, where you're well served, most of the area of the province is not under conservation authorities' jurisdiction. And when the retreat of these provincial agencies, retreat of the provincial policy, you at least have some buffer. But I come from Northern Ontario, and although there's a conservation authority just around North Bay, that's all there is. There's one just around Sudbury, one just around Timmins. But vast areas of this province are Crown land, and these kinds of problems exist, and the government is increasingly retreating from its role. And that's a challenge for me as the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario. Thank you very much.